Over the past decade and change, much ink and YouTube bandwidth has been spilled over the advent of streaming and its effects on TV shows, from shorter episode counts, higher budgets, and greater time between seasons, to the saturation of A-list actors and cinematic devices that have all come to define prestige TV aesthetics in the streaming era. I recommend watching these videos on screen, which have covered these topics quite well in different ways. In this video, I will attempt to explore from a formal perspective how these things all manifest in a single trend. In fact, I'm going to be focusing on a single word for the next hour: stratification. Read it, learn it, memorize it, because I'm going to be saying it a lot. Stratification, the complete separation and compartmentalization of a TV show's core elements. The opposite of cohesion, the rejection of uniformity, the oil and waterification of this beloved medium. To illustrate what I'm talking about, let's look at the TV formula from which stratification departs, starting with a genre of television that has no shame in wearing its conventions on its sleeve: the sitcom. In the standard 20th century sitcom, you usually have 3 or 4 main sets along with a few new locations depending on the mandates of a given episode. In a typical episode, all of the lead characters convene at these sets, or at least one primary set before splitting off into A, B, and C plots, and these function as the rendezvous points for the characters to recount the events of the episode to each other, and by proxy to us. Not only do we have these standard sets, but also the expectation that each of the leads is in pretty much every episode. TV, by virtue of its sheer volume of output up until the past decade and change, resorted to these measures out of efficiency and financial necessity. When you build one set and stick to it for 20 episodes, you cut down on production costs 20 times. Even more when you consider that these shows set up shop for years of constant production. They effectively had an assembly line operation that depended on these aspects being standardized and consistent, and as a result, a dramatic language built around this consistency was established and reinforced for 60 years. I use sitcoms as the clearest example here, but this idea applies to most TV genres. The Western of the 50s and 60s, with its saloons and ranches, the police procedural with its frequent returns to the precinct to debrief. Even in a show about people traveling the country, visiting a different state in every episode, the character's car becomes the consistent set. In recent years, however, TV shows have seemingly become allergic to this consistency of having their principal cast occupy a shared space together in every episode, or even most episodes. Storylines, character arcs, and locations all occur more and more separately from each other, with increasing distance between them, and a certain level of cohesion has disappeared from the TV landscape. At best, this practice displays exciting potential for experimentation within the TV formula, and at its worst, it seems to suggest a complete lack of understanding of these TV fundamentals. Most recently, the Apple TV Plus series Severance has struck me as the most extreme perpetrator of this trend, to both good and bad ends. But what I'm describing goes back much further than that. So before I get into Severance, I'd like to traverse through a series of case studies to understand why this is supposedly the new MO in TV. Join me on this journey. And while you're at it, why don't you like, comment, subscribe, and shit, maybe even hit that notification bell. Welcome to the world of stratification.
Every conversation I've had, something I take away so much and lose a lot.
The earliest example I'm going to look into is Lena Dunham's HBO series Girls, which debuted in 2012. It's a show that initially had a mixed reception on account of the privileged and myopic perspective of the main characters, which was exacerbated by Dunham's real-world antics. But as time has progressed, people have begun to more collectively embrace the show as a self-aware deconstruction of the Sex and the City dynamic, an intention made explicit in the show's pilot episode.
I'm definitely a Carrie at heart, but sometimes Samantha kind of comes out. And then, when I'm at school, I definitely try and put on my Miranda hat.
The show's mission statement is basically taking Sex and the City's archetypes and applying them to the de-romanticized landscape of millennial New York. The characters are more jaded and, again, self-aware, frequently verbally identifying how they stray from or play into their archetypes in pop culture.
You are from New York, therefore you are just naturally interesting.
I would call you a little unstimulating.
Unstimulating? What are we in, a fucking Jane Austen novel?
Which makes for a lot of insightful social commentary as their behavior oscillates between irony and sincerity at a breakneck pace, but Dunham also applies this deconstruction to the show's form. Sex and the City had a uniform structure that slots very neatly into what I described earlier, in which the gang would check in with each other at brunch or over drinks in every episode to recount their misadventures and exchange perspectives. It wasn't so uniform that it was one specific set in every episode, but they had their regular spots they'd return to throughout the show. One One has to look no further than And Just Like That to see how the landscape has changed. Characters off on their own side adventures, just kind of formlessly ambling on with no sense of narrative cohesion or even direction because they so infrequently get together to recap their experiences or express their intentions or desires to each other in a regular capacity. Stuff basically just happens. I think Dunham departs from Sex and the City's formula in a rather profound way, instead of in the totally soulless manner of And Just Like That. And I think it's important to begin our study of stratification by analyzing the great potential this liberation from formula has. Unlike Carrie Bradshaw and her friends, Hannah Horvath and the other 3 titular girls only share a total of 12 scenes altogether throughout the show's 62-episode run. I got that figure from IMDb Trivia, so feel free to fact-check me on that, but it's something in that ballpark. They rarely check in with each other on what's going on in their lives, there are many episodes some of the girls aren't even in, and there are whole seasonal or at least multi-episode arcs where one of the characters will be in an entirely different city, such as when Hannah enters a writing program in Wyoming or when Shoshana takes a job in Tokyo. Girls does have some regular locations we return to, mainly the characters' apartments and Cafe Grumpy's, but these spaces are given a lot less load-bearing responsibility and a lot less emotional weight than in these other sitcoms. The perk of a show having an increased budget through some sort of premium subscription service like HBO, compounded by the benefits of digital cinematography and increasingly mobile film equipment, is that it is no longer constrained to the sets that were previously adhered to out of logistical necessity, and are now free to explore the characters just where they happen to be at a given time. At first, it may seem like a shortcoming of the show that these spaces feel less significant, as reflected by the fact that Girls has failed to generate a bus tour in the same capacity as Sex and the City or Gossip Girl. You know, the most important metric we have available to us. But I think this deviation actually reflects something a little more authentic about friendship than Sex and the City gave us, which is how it not only holds together, but also weathers between points of contact. Friends in the real world frequently spend a lot of time apart and often learn by necessity to maintain their relationships across the time between seeing each other. Just as often, though, they also drift apart. By the end of Girls' final season, these 4 are barely even friends with each other anymore. Their final resolution is essentially acknowledging that they've reached the end of the line with each other, which is a depressing but very real emotional experience that I believe can only be expressed this viscerally by upending the TV formula. Not only does it reflect a very immediate emotional experience, but I think it speaks to something broader than just the specific manner in which millennials navigate friendships. The rejection of sets, of Monk's Cafe, and Cheers, and McLaren's, and Central Perk also speaks to the rejection of a third place. Buzzword alert, I know, but consider that the initial scare around TV back when it first took over the media landscape was that it was keeping people home instead of going out, which was true, at least for the intents and purposes of stimulating the economy. But within the home, there was still a specific spot people gathered at a specific time to essentially vicariously go to these third places, so the social function still held, to some degree. Or if you didn't watch the episode with someone, everyone was talking about the same episodes throughout the following week as they waited for the next one. I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that there's a correlation between access to these shows extending to every device now at any time the user desires, and the increased dissipation of general communication and personal interaction. Now conversations about TV in the real world more or less boil down to this college humor sketch.
Are you guys watching Orphan Black?
No, but I heard it's so good.
I'm still working my way through House of Cards Season 3.
Don't say anything, I haven't seen season 2 yet.
I might watch it too, so don't say anything about season 1.
Meanwhile, we all have our own niche communities online to talk about our specific interests within. After all, the show was incubated starting in 2010, the year HBO launched its first streaming service, HBO Go, and then officially filmed in 2011. Although Netflix's streaming platform predates HBO Go by 3 years, it wouldn't release its first original series until after Girls' first season had already been filmed.
I don't have Netflix, I only have HBO Go.
So this was very early in the streaming timeline. Part of this correlation is the fact that technology affects things in conjunction. It just so happens that both TV and communications are able to be more and more remotely accessible, and the two don't necessarily have anything to do with each other directly. But TV, like any art, reflects the culture that produced it, and the culture reflects what it sees on TV. So a feedback loop is formed here. These shows on streaming about people no longer connecting are not just an emotional influence on people not connecting in the real world, but to some extent, the very instrument by which these people at home separate themselves from each other. This isn't a value judgment. I only bring it up to describe the kind of friendship only maintainable in the digital age, which I believe the stratification in Girls exemplifies. And even though in this case, the stratification reflects a very human experience, I think my next example is much more transparent about the destructive quality streaming services had in shaking up the fabric of a TV show's makeup.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
In 2013, Netflix revived the tragically cancelled Arrested Development in what will be remembered as one of the most infamous harbingers of streaming TV form and production. After years away from the Bluth family, audiences were chomping at the bit to see what their favorite dysfunctional family was up to. And what they got was not quite the expected return to form. By this point, most of the cast had undergone illustrious Hollywood careers and had schedules far too busy to realign at the old Bluth model home. As a result, the revival season decided to basically shoot each actor on their own availability, and in order for this to work, the story needed to be incredibly scattered. What they settled on was a narrative structure where the same chronological period basically plays out again and again in each episode, but focusing on one specific character and what they were doing during this period. We have the Michael episode, then the Job episode, then the George Sr. episode, and so on. In other words, there is significantly less interaction among the main cast, and in its place, a series of new characters our leads split off and interact with instead. There's not necessarily zero crossover. Each member of the family exists to varying degrees in the other's lives, but the core unit the original series was built around has dissolved, and the characters are stratified, there's that word again, to their own specific narrative threads. Looking at the season 12 years later, this could even be seen as a premonition of pandemic filmmaking, a style consisting of people in separate rooms and separate locations, communicating either over phone or video call, or two actors in a given scene shooting their coverage at separate times using an eyeline marker for continuity, only later edited into the scene together. The audience can always tell when the actors are not organically playing off of each other. With pandemic filmmaking, this style at least reflected an ability to bring people together through cinematic means when the real world made it impossible to be in the same room. A formal act of defiance reflecting a universal experience. Imagine then when the justification, instead of a global pandemic, is people who live in the same city simply being too busy to get together. And I say that dismissively, but there is some strong dramatic potential there, a melancholic sense of geographical proximity but emotional distance that feels like fertile ground for complicated familial emotions to come to light, even in a zany comedy like Arrested Development. Call it a lack of that Dunham panache, but this time around, the separation between the characters doesn't feel like an honest reflection of people growing apart, doesn't tap into the tragedy inherent to an estranged family. It feels like a shallow cover-up for logistical roadblocks, an ad hoc solution. But of course, there is a learning opportunity here. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The golden currency in TV is status quo, the ability to conjure the feeling of routine, normalcy, everyday living, a sense of stasis. At their heart, most TV shows are about a character trying to get out of their situation. In Orange is the New Black, Piper's trying to get out of prison alive. In Mr. Robot, Elliot's trying to take down Evil Corps. In Schitt's Creek, the characters are quite simply trying to get out of Schitt's Creek. This isn't a catch-all structure, especially in sitcoms or procedurals, but it reveals how important an element status quo is, and how delicate of a balancing act it is to both threaten and maintain over the course of many seasons. If these characters accomplish their overarching goals, then we have no story left to tell. But the story has to progress to some degree so it doesn't feel like we're running in circles. A TV show has to constantly provide the illusion of shaking things up while still, on some fundamental level, maintaining status quo. A show like The Boys teases frequent destruction of status quo, ends every episode with some sort of, oh shit, this changes everything cliffhanger, and then in the next episode we're back to square one. This can feel like a cheap trick after a while.
I know who killed Laura Palmer.
Who was it? I don't remember.
Some change does have to occur. A story has to progress and the characters have to develop, but if you change too much, you lose any sense of anchoring the audience may have felt. Let's look at Search Party, another show featuring the great Alia Shawkat. In season 1, the status quo is that Dory and her friends are looking for a missing girl, forming the titular search party. By the end of the season, they find her, so the rest of the show is spent inventing new conflicts based on new cliffhangers from each previous season. There's no consistent scope to the story anymore, so season 2 flounders to find its footing by attempting to craft an entire season around the emotional aftermath of the previous season. Season 3, I actually think redeems itself a little bit with a contained courtroom drama, and establishes a new status quo for the show, in which each season is basically a standalone genre piece, almost a soft anthology structure, which is a new kind of consistency. But by seasons 4 and 5, the writers lose the narrative completely, only to end the show by throwing up their hands with a fuck it COVID allegory. In short, They tied up the loose ends that formed the base foundation of the show too soon, and eventually it posed irreparable problems for the show. By comparison, look at Breaking Bad. Ostensibly, the status quo is that Walt has cancer and has to pay for his treatment, but wants out of the life of crime he wades into, cooking meth in the RV. Over time, things change. He gets treatment for the cancer, he gets the RV demolished, various employers and villains come and go, and our world does constantly change in a very palpable, material way. But the double life continues as Walt realizes he's no longer Heisenberg out of necessity, but rather because he likes it and it gives him purpose. In other words, his situation remains constant throughout the show, even as his original circumstances for it change. I know this is like the most basic TV show to point to as an example in a video essay, and comparing it to Search Party is like comparing The Godfather to Pretty Woman, but I truly think this is the clearest demonstration of how to achieve the balance of change and consistency that TV so depends on. We can take this idea and apply it to shows that aren't necessarily about a character escaping their situation. In a crime show like Dexter, the character may not be actively trying to get out of their situation so much as trying to preserve it. But we know there's a ticking clock as the law closes in around them. In shows with no ticking clock, something has to put an end to the status quo to earn a sense of finality. This is where the significance of the sets I talked about earlier comes into play. It gives these shows that don't necessarily have any sort of long-term narrative fuse an opportunity to end with the characters graduating high school, or moving out of their house or apartment, or going to jail. Otherwise, you wind up with a procedural that goes 30 seasons, like Grey's Anatomy or any number of NCIS CSI shows. Or look once more at our recurring example, Sex and the City. After a few great seasons, the show begins to suffer from the fact that there is no end goal in sight. We've circled the drain with Big, and after a certain point, we are just living with the characters. So the series finale is kind of an oddball episode that doesn't really give anything a sense of finality. Then 2 movies, and a reboot that is truly directionless. If you wrap the status quo up too early, your story becomes aimless. But if you have no end goal in sight, your story also becomes aimless. This brings us back to Arrested Development. In its original run, the show had a very clear-cut status quo. Michael Bluth wants out of the family business, out of the family home, and basically out of the family period. But he's trapped in the Bluth model home, and all these characters populate his life in every episode, living manifestations of his inability to escape his circumstance. In season 4, that status quo is completely uprooted. Michael is no longer trapped in his circumstance, and as a result, we the audience feel an aimlessness about still following these characters. The show has more issues typical of anything trying to recapture the magic of a bygone era, but I really think this separation of the main cast from each other is the key factor that did it in. So I guess the takeaway from this section is that status quo is probably the most important element of a TV show, and stratification is one of the surefire ways of smearing the audience's sense of status quo beyond existence. Oh hey, there's Ben Stiller. I bring him up for no reason. This video is sponsored by you, the viewer. I haven't posted a video since December, but did you know that over on Patreon, there is currently more than 5 hours worth of film discussion that I've posted in that time, which you could view right now? Or right after this video? Patron shows and reviews, podcast-style analyses, it's all up there, just waiting for you. So head on over to patreon.com/TaylorJWilliams and see what the other side of my stratified internet presence has in store for you. You may not think it at first, but Atlanta is very much cut from the girl's cloth. Written, often directed, and showrun by the person who plays the main character. You may call it a stretch, as this is increasingly becoming a more common practice in TV, but consider that Donald Glover played a recurring character in season 2 of Girls, and has an established rapport with Dunham, complicated as it may be. Atlanta even starts out as a much more conventional half-hour dramedy in its pilot episode, but I believe Glover took Dunham's approach to stratifying her main characters and stretched it to even greater extremes. The key difference from Girls that I want to highlight here is that over the course of the series, we begin to see Glover lose interest in himself as the prospective character. Earn, especially in the first season, functions as a pretty conventional audience surrogate, wading into the uncharted waters of Atlanta's music industry, and his antipathy and wisecracking at the many comically surreal situations he finds himself in serve the purpose of giving us an anchor. We identify with Earn, so we respond more or less how Glover, through Earn, is telegraphing us to respond. The byproduct of this approach is that Earn is the least interesting character in the ensemble, and I think over time Glover began to realize that We no longer need that anchor point to respond to the absurd concepts he was working with. Season 2 sees a lot more solo episodes, following each member of the ensemble on their own side quests, and this is where the show really opens up and paves way to experimentation. Consider that the most popular episode of the season, Teddy Perkins, is a two-hander in which our audience surrogate is now Lakeith Stanfield's Darius, who's otherwise the wild card of the group we previously needed an anchor from, and that he's now playing the straight man against this Michael Jackson riff, played by none other than Glover. He has to completely transform himself, quite literally wearing someone else's skin to avoid playing Ern. This approach continues into the show's most controversial season, but the one I think is its most formally ambitious. In Atlanta's third season, Glover identifies the two components of status quo our conversation today is revolved around, location and character, and completely isolates them from one another. He recognizes that Atlanta is, on one hand, a show about Ern, Al, Darius, and Van, and on the other hand, it's a show that takes place in Atlanta. He recognizes that these are the two core ideas we combine to form the identity of the TV show Atlanta in our heads, and he stratifies them completely. Season 3 sees the crew on a European tour, not once stepping foot in their hometown throughout the duration of the season. As we check in with them on this tour, they're still largely separated from each other, rarely sharing scenes together in what has become characteristic Atlanta fashion. We'll call these the character episodes. In between the character episodes in Europe, and actually what kicks off the season in its premiere, are the location episodes. These are essentially self-contained anthology episodes taking place in America, with none of the characters we know and love. They don't all outright say that they take place in Atlanta, but they evoke a more symbolic vibe of the city congruent with the previous two seasons. Glover said of the season that Atlanta is more a point of view or a state of mind than a physical place, and that's what the location episodes conjure, adopting a fable-like folklore quality, and further mythologizing the city by consisting of various surreal sociological premises. This mutual exclusivity seeks to deconstruct how we understand a show's identity. Call this a pretentious read or even main takeaway of the season, but I think its Picasso-inspired poster makes this deconstructive intent pretty undeniably clear. I think this approach in Atlanta now gives us a pretty good springboard to see how doing something ambitious and influential can spawn imitators that do the same thing far less effectively. Which brings me to... To be completely honest, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the show Ramy. Part of Atlanta's ripple effect was FX Hulu subsequently producing an onslaught of auto-fiction type shows about the creators playing thinly veiled versions of themselves, which along with the likes of Dave and Pen 15 included Ramy. In this case, I find the self-insert character harder to contend with than Ern. Possibly because he shares a name with creator and star Ramy Youssef, there's less separation between person and character, and much of the character Ramy's journey feels like, I hate to say it, Youssef exhibiting main character syndrome. I know that's unfair to say, and as a writer, I think Youssef is great at building an episode around a single philosophical conundrum. Ramy's framework allows him to tap into the culture and create these comedic but poignant scenarios that, crucially, use the principles of Islam to introspect on more universal moral dilemmas. The arc of a given episode is based more on its moral structure than on physical plot, and I have a lot of respect for the show in that regard. But I think my barrier of entry early on in the show was that one too many of these dilemmas boiled down to how many times can Youssef make Ramy hook up with a beautiful woman and then feel bad about it? How many times can Ramy look broodingly past the camera with a face that says, I'm so fucked up? This self-sabotage only escalates as the show goes on, and it feels like Ramy, both the person and the character, are addicted to this self-inflicted misery in a way that kind of neutralizes itself. Rather than coming across as a tragic figure for any of the sacrilegious acts he commits throughout the show, he comes across as someone a little too invested in romanticizing himself as a tragic figure. In Ramy's latest season, it appears Youssef is contending with similar anxieties about writing himself into these scenarios and continuing his character's cyclical sinning. He's directed more episodes than ever, and he's in fewer episodes than ever. Like Glover, his interest behind the camera is beginning to eclipse his interest in front of it. But I think the result this time around is a little bit clunkier. For one, I want to point out a phenomenon that I call the Hulu Mom episode, one of the most transparent yet effective awards baiting strategies that's popped up in recent years, in which a TV show, primarily one of these Hulu FX shows, will break its standard format and focus on one character, often the main character's mom, in a piece of grounded, contemplative drama to prove that whatever sitcom we're watching also has serious writer chops. For what it's worth, this is of the same ilk as The Last of Us plus Bodel episode about Nick Offerman and Murray Bartlett, which was a smash hit come awards season. While it expectedly attracted some significant pushback from conservative freaks upset about the series showcasing a gay love story, as well as some pushback from people taking issue with the tokenization and decomplication of these characters from the game into something much more sentimental and phony, my pushback to the episode stems from the fact that it is the third episode of the series. I know it was only a 9-episode season, but they hadn't nearly accrued enough goodwill in the first 2 episodes to earn a digression like that. And the fact that there are 2 flashback episodes in this 9-episode season where, let's be honest, like 3 things of note actually happen, strikes me as the worst of what stratification and Huluification and awards baiting is capable of. I mean, talk about a TV show that never found its footing. I could do a whole video about The Last of Us, and with the new season coming out right now, maybe I will. But I'm getting off track. Ramy is not nearly this bad, for the record. The thing that differentiates it from other mom episode perpetrators is that, while ultimately about Ramy himself and intimately fixated on him, especially in the second season, it does the mom episode thing for every member of Ramy's family. We get an episode about Ramy's mom, an episode about Ramy's dad, an episode about his sister, an episode about his uncle. In the latest season, we get an episode about his friend in which all his other friends are present, but Ramy is nowhere to be found. At this point in the show, there's a bit of a through line about Ramy selling out and maybe being too good or too busy for the people in his life, which maybe suggests a bit of a meta-narrative with Yusuf seeing more and more industry success, but for the life of me, I can't come up with a good on-the-ground justification for why Ramy wouldn't be present in half of these situations, other than I know Yusuf directed this episode himself. He's missing from half of this latest season, save for maybe a one-scene cameo. A lot of these solo episodes are very compelling. The characters are well observed, I'm invested in all of their different arcs, and the show strikes me as very episodic and self-contained, which in my book is a good thing. But I do believe this lack of larger scope cohesion hurts the show as a whole. While the season structure is very closely comparable to Atlanta's second season, I think Atlanta gets away with it because it is better able to constantly recontextualize itself and lean into being something offbeat and experimental rather than the girls-esque dramedy it teased itself to be in the early episodes. I mean, the show isn't called Earn after all. But more importantly, it feels like a decision rooted in Glover's desire to reach outward and expand the scope of the show, the result of curiosity. Ramy's absence in these middle episodes comes across as self-flagellating, like he's punishing himself by removing himself from his own show. In other words, even though we're seeing the other characters' lives, it's still about him. Everything still points inward. I don't think Ramy would have existed without the precedent Atlanta set, but I think if the show had been made in a pre-Atlanta TV landscape, it wouldn't be able to get away with such separated narratives. Would have to tease these separate character arcs into a more integrated story structure that's reinforced in every episode. And I think Yusuf would then, by necessity, get out of his own way. The analogy I default to when describing this sort of thing is the cooking concept of emulsion, of slowly incorporating an ingredient in gradual doses so that it cohesively mixes with whatever it's being added to. I think recurring characters are a good demonstration of this concept. In Seinfeld, Jerry's parents are in 20 episodes out of 172. That's barely 10% of the show. But they're given their due in every season, many of which stagger their appearances evenly throughout, so as a result we internalize them as a consistent presence in the show, as opposed to, say, Susan, who's technically in more episodes than Jerry's parents, but is concentrated to 2 specific seasons. Or take a look at the high fantasy and sci-fi genres, which typically have many factioned A, B, and C plots across continents or even planets. Let's see how Game of Thrones, for instance, avoids the pitfalls of stratification by adhering to a more classical style of serialized narrative. Because there are so many different characters in so many different places from each other, the show by necessity has to provide some normalcy and consistency in its filmmaking. Most lead characters do appear in every episode of a given season, at least for as long as they're alive, and the one character who's deliberately left out of a season is done so consciously within hard established parameters, and his time away when he returns is felt. Once the show hits its stride, the average episode basically adopts a structure of check in with character A, check in with character B, check in with character C, and so on and so forth. Maybe we'll follow up with 1 or 2 of them a second time before the episode's over, just to tie things up in a nice package. Looking at a single episode in a vacuum, it almost eschews plot structure. We're getting status updates rather than a full story in each episode, but that's because it's a show that places more emphasis on the seasonal arcs due to the books they're drawing from. In order to achieve this meticulous cohesion across a season, we need consistent locations that we return to and familiarize ourselves with, and reinforce the connection between that location and the character we're checking in with there, week after week. The best seasons of Game of Thrones demonstrate that even the most stratified narratives can be cohesively stitched together. Ironically, it's when the characters start meeting up and de-stratifying the narrative that the show falls apart. I know this all sounds a little too prescriptive, or very much like the whining of a traditionalist scared of change. I promise I'm a fan of changing landscapes, which is why I've attempted to stagger the good and the bad so far. I just think, as far as stratification goes, there is some throwing of the proverbial baby out with the bathwater going on. While much of my thesis here revolves around traditional shows that span multiple seasons and have to maintain a stronger sense of uniformity across them, I want to veer off on a quick interlude into the wild west of the miniseries format, to explore how certain entries from the past few years illuminate some of the formal qualities I'm talking about. One such example is Twin Peaks, whose third season, The Return, functions as a self-contained miniseries. The original show revolutionized TV 35 years ago with its meticulous serialization, back when it was a novel concept, at least in popular American TV, to have to tune in every week to understand the show on a most basic level. It's partly responsible for the lack of episodic cohesion and self-containment that's become increasingly prevalent in TV, but it obviously worked there. I believe this is largely due to Mark Frost's understanding of tradition and TV convention, because you'll find that for as serialized as the show is, there's still episodic consistency. Like we discussed with Game of Thrones, every principal character is more or less in every episode anchored to these iconic locations we revisit week after week. Even though the narrative is much more linear and segmented across the span of the show, status quo is constantly being reinforced through this repetition. This idea serves as a great foundation to see how Twin Peaks' third season, The Return, contorts this framework into something resembling a little more what I'm talking about. Produced 25 years later, we revisit many of the original series locations, but the show has no nostalgia for them, and in no way shoots them in the same manner as the original series. Gone are the conventional TV practices of having standardized wides that assure consistency across seasons. Being a self-contained miniseries, so to speak, with no intention of continuing thereafter, enabled the freedom of a different kind of coverage. So many of the sets we know and love are unceremoniously revisited, or even abandoned in favor of more modern, liminal, gentrification core locations, at least half of the show not even taking place in Twin Peaks. And so too are the beloved characters unceremoniously revisited and often overlooked in favor of new, more generic-looking characters. More importantly, though, the principal characters barely even interact with each other. Even our main character is absent from town and stratified into the dual and briefly tri-character performance of Mr. C, Dougie Jones, and the Dougie Jonesified mush-brain Dale Cooper, none of whom are actually, at least mentally, the original character Dale Cooper who anchored us in the original series. He doesn't return until the third to last episode, after which he gets about 10 minutes of screen time to rehash his classic Cooperisms before disappearing into abstraction in the show's experimental final episode. Without him serving as the connective tissue among our ensemble, the show takes on a much more observational mode, cutting around the town to check in on how people are doing in their own separate routines rather than making them interact with each other, or with Cooper. It's so stratified that it's left unclear if some of these characters even exist in the same timeline or universe as each other. In particular, Audrey Horne's arc ends in a cosmic nightmare sequence that suggests she was maybe never even in the continuity we've been watching to begin with. This reminds me of a certain property of the non-miniseries Westworld, which debuted its first season the year before Twin Peaks: The Return. That show exploits the stratification and lack of characters interacting with each other to build to its monumental reveal that not everything we've watched is happening at the same time. That in fact, people we naturally assumed were different characters are actually the same character we're seeing at different points in time. This is only possible by implementing the device of human-like automatons who never age, separately interacting with these people, so that we have no reason to assume this isn't all happening at the same time until the reveal. This sort of inside versus outside, time existing in a vacuum as a tool for the TV show, serves as a precursor to Severance, by the way, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And many of these properties can also be found in the last miniseries I want to talk about in this section, HBO's Watchmen. This is another show that, like The Return, is technically a sequel, but also its own self-contained thing, and it really experiments with the episodic format. The first few episodes unfold pretty conventionally, establishing a sense of tradition to its narrative structure. Then suddenly we get an episode following a side character, then a flashback episode, then another flashback episode, and essentially the entire back half of the series' structure is just jumping around this way until the ending. What feels like an abandonment of our sense of stasis is, however, very characteristic of Watchmen in externalizing Dr. Manhattan's ability to perceive all of time at once, his constantly scatterbrained, omnipresent mental state. Damon Lindelof, having perfected this technique of jumping around in time on Lost, was a natural fit for this approach. So while the show does many of the same things as The Return, as far as unceremonious revisits of our beloved characters and having a general fuck you attitude towards obvious fan service pandering, it does maintain a core tenet of the source material structure and applies it to a new medium, weaponizing episodic structure in a way Zack Snyder's straightforward adaptation of the source material never could. If anything, I think the show's biggest downfall is, in a sense, suffering from the success of this formal approach. When we get to the end and have to wrap up loose ends in a more conventional manner, it feels like the magic leading up to that point sort of fizzles out. The miniseries format naturally lends itself to different levels of standardization than a TV show. There's freedom to try this sort of freeform experimentation without fear of continuing the story in a multi-seasonal manner and maintaining the same level of years-long consistency. I think Twin Peaks is once again an illuminating example here, because what that show is able to accomplish really boils down to David Lynch's personal philosophy in approaching The Return. He saw it as a movie rather than a TV show. Now, the debate of whether The Return is a show or a movie is a bit of a discourse nuke, but I maintain that it is a TV show. Sorry to Lynch, the greatest American artist to ever do it, but on this one point I have to agree. Maybe Lynch had to justify it as a movie to himself in order to approach the narrative and abstract qualities of the show the way he did, but I think it's a disservice to The Return to act like it doesn't exploit the unique possibilities of the episodic format. The original series basically reinvented TV, and The Return somehow pulled off the miracle of reinventing TV as we know it again, and I think the whole Twin Peaks The Return is a movie take waters that accomplishment down a little bit. Still, I think Lynch's assertion illuminates a big factor in TV that has also paved the way to increased stratification. I don't think it's any secret that shows are becoming more and more like movies. I mean, the Surf Dracula meme pretty comprehensively embodies this phenomenon, but I think it goes deeper than just episodic approach versus way too serialized approach. One of the key distinctions we make between movies and TV is who we see as the key authorial voice on a given project. In film, the director has traditionally been held unilaterally responsible for the artistic decision-making of a given movie since at least the advent of auteur theory. And in TV, the showrunner is head honcho. Often the show's original creator, the showrunner also coordinates the writer's room, and the importance of this fact is that TV has traditionally been understood as a writer's medium, or at least belonging as much to the writers as to the cast. In other words, the position that has been most relegated to journeymen in the TV space is the director, most shows cycling a number of directors who are basically there to make their days and maintain the consistency established by the showrunner and the writers. If the showrunner changes over the course of the show, people catch on. Look at how The West Wing, Community, or, once again, Sex and the City, all tanked once their original showrunners left. Any Simpsons fan worth their salt will be able to break down the defining attributes of each showrunner's respective seasons. But things are changing. Movies are becoming more TV-like, with directors in mega franchises serving placeholder positions, basically steering the ship while aesthetic consistency is maintained across multiple entries, more akin to the traditional TV model. And again, TV is becoming more movie-like, abandoning episodic containment and becoming an increased showcase of directorial input. Think about the number of shows today have talked about in terms of their director. Girls, Atlanta, Ramy, Twin Peaks, Mr. Robot, Watchmen. Most of these directors are also the showrunners of their respective shows, but I think it's worth noting how much more stock is increasing for directors in TV. In Severance, take note of how heavily conversations around the show have skewed toward Ben Stiller, often steamrolling creator and showrunner Dan Erickson. This is a TV show you can look at and very easily say, yeah, this was made by the guy who made The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. The show's companion podcast is run by Stiller and longtime Stiller collaborator Adam Scott, and not Erickson. I don't want to turn this section into a piece of speculation regarding their behind-the-scenes relationship, nor do I intend to minimize Stiller's role as executive producer, fighting for the show to be made in the first place. But I bring this all up to highlight how representative Severance is of directors beginning to usurp showrunners in TV. Both seasons of Severance have had notoriously messy productions with major delays and significant overtime and days cited in which nothing actually got filmed. This reminds me of a Facebook post by one Paul Schrader, which I've been thinking about a lot lately. He laments that a regular feature script used to be 120 pages instead of 90, and a regular feature production period was 65 days days instead of 20, yet runtime remains the same. It's true what he says about feature filmmaking, but TV has always had to shoot a lot more material within a much denser window of time. This is what has dictated TV aesthetics for so long, the reason it was for decades a series of wides with the occasional close-up for emotional emphasis, why so many network procedurals are shot with the same assembly line shot reverse shot coverage on the same sets. But now movies and TV seem to be evolving in opposite directions. Premium networks like HBO and Showtime, long before the advent of streaming, revolutionized this restriction through subscriber-funded inflated budgets, which I talked about a bit in the girls section. This is why Lynch was able to approach The Return like he was shooting a movie. This is ironic because network demands are what initially caused Twin Peaks' demise, and also Showtime briefly fired Lynch from the revival, so this feels like a redemption of sorts. Here he is talking about the need for time to experiment on set, and budgeting time for feeling things out intuitively, and not worrying about how long a scene is.
It just drives me nuts that we have to do something in 2 days. Somebody arbitrarily says you gotta do it in 2 days. No, that fucking really pisses me off. Okay. It really does. We're always up against the fucking, I'm not working this way again, ever.
It's worth noting, though, that HBO and Showtime et al. Predate streaming, and looking at their output in the 90s and early 2000s, they still adhere to the traditional frameworks. It's only once streaming took over that they seem to have predominantly adopted this more free-form language, and I think part of that also has to do with who's running the streaming services. Tech companies have begun dominating the TV production landscape. We have Amazon as a juggernaut streaming provider and creator of original series, same with Apple, and because they're able to subsidize their TV departments with funds from all the other stuff under their corporate umbrella, Stiller and Erickson are able to spend an entire production day arguing and shooting nothing. We're able to get oneers that take weeks to shoot and consist entirely of Adam Scott running down a hallway. A TV episode can be celebrated as someone's directorial debut, when in the past we used to overlook the TV background of such filmmakers as Michael Mann and only consider their first studio-produced features their directorial debuts. And I have complicated thoughts about this. I think limitations foster creativity, and there's a degree to which too many freedoms allow Stiller and Erickson to scratch their heads and string their crew along and play it real loose with their writing. But I also think the state of the industry is pretty starved of this kind of freedom right now. In addition to the Schrader Facebook post, this reminds me of a quote from James Gray.
The movie business made a critical mistake to think of it as, this film did not make a ton of money, thus we don't make that film. This film will make a ton of money, thus we make that one. A very strict balance sheet equation. When you make movies that only make a ton of money, and they're only one kind of movie, you begin to get a large segment of the population out of the habit of going to the movies. And then you begin to eliminate the importance of movies culturally.
He argues that studios need to stop focusing so much on tentpole event movies, to be prepared to not immediately recoup the individual budget of an individual movie, and be able to take a financial hit on mid-budget projects, so as to invest in a more broad-based interest in movies, in the cultural ripple effects that will get people to watch more movies over time, and take a risk on a wider variety of movies in general. Now, Severance is far from a mid-budget project. It's one of the most expensive TV shows ever made. Gray's original point was also explicitly against streaming and advocating specifically for the theatrical release of feature films, and streaming does complicate the sentiment of taking a hit on an individual film or show, as it's harder to apply those metrics to a subscription model where box office isn't really traceable anymore. But I want to be optimistic that what he's describing is still attainable, even if we can't put streaming back in the bottle. On one hand, I look at Apple investing way more than they should into a show like Severance, and I see a studio ready to take a financial hit for the sake of creative decision-making. On the other hand, I look at how much the show could get by on people just sitting in rooms together talking, and I see a line crossed into actual excess, that this is once again a studio focusing on a tentpole release and giving it all the bells and whistles to make sure butts are in seats, or rather that credit cards are registered for auto-subscription renewals. Meanwhile, anything mid-budget suffers as a result. Because it's true, Severance is one of the few tentpole water-cooler TV shows we have currently running at this point. And that's why I think it's important that we examine it to see how it embodies all the trends I've talked about today. So without further ado, Severance is a show that has stratification baked into the very fabric of its premise. Being about a procedure that literally splits your consciousness into two separate people, triggered by geographic stimuli, it's a no-brainer that this show would indulge in many of the tendencies I've outlined. But unlike other shows about a double life I've discussed, the mutually exclusive consciousnesses of our leads disrupt any sort of connective tissue we would get from having a Tony Soprano or Walter White navigate all the various corners of his double life. The two worlds are almost completely separate here. I've had a bit of a complicated relationship with Severance. It's a show I always think I'm ever so slightly above, but then it inevitably proves me wrong. Effectively a hotbed of every philosophy YouTuber's favorite concepts: panopticon, myth of Sisyphus, Plato's allegory of the cave, a Marxist alienation. The basic setup of the show is so metaphorically loaded that I was initially put off by how much it bogs itself down with more literal plotting and world building. I thought it didn't live up to the symbolic potential it came in with, even if I knew how silly of an expectation it was for a $200 million TV show released by one of the big 5 tech companies to actually be a call to arms against our corporate overlords in pursuit of self-determination. In particular, even though I enjoyed the show on a scene-to-scene level, for the most part I found myself increasingly frustrated at the number of mystery boxes the show opens up. This is the J.J. Abrams term for teasing some bizarre, mysterious element in a story and edging the audience until they get an answer at the end as a reward for sticking through a given story. The catch being that as a writer, you don't really need to have the answer, the thing in the box, figured out. The box itself is the important thing, because that's how you keep viewers hooked. So when Mark S. and the gang stumble upon this room of goats, or we keep getting teased with the importance of Tumwater, my knee-jerk reaction was a bit cynical towards these elements. My thinking was that, just as Lumen cuck Dylan chips away at Tumwater for the promise of a waffle party and other office swag, we chip away at the series and renew our Apple TV Plus subscriptions for the promise of learning what Tumwater actually is. The thing is, I was still in college when the first season came out. With seasons now taking longer than ever to produce, I'm in a completely different stage of my life now, part of which involves a corporate day job wherein I sit at a computer organizing material I don't entirely understand. In fact, I'm the only employee who goes into the office, and that office is located in a supremely purgatorial WeWork, so I experienced stratification on pretty much a daily basis. Rewatching Severance this year, I gained a new appreciation for these mystery box elements. No longer did they strike me as little cheese niblets to string us, the unthinking audience of mice, along with. They struck me much more as manifestations of the absurd complexities of corporate America and the intentional obfuscation of companies' more sordid practices and ties that exist higher up the corporate chain you go. I know the season 2 finale is pretty much reneged on this, but for a while there I hoped we would never learn what Tumwater actually is, or why goats are being bred on corporate grounds. I get why narratively the show has to tie up these loose ends they throw in front of us and explain things, but I would honestly rather they keep opening up boxes and hint at an infinite expanse within Lumen, without paying any of it off. I think it would be more expressive of the average worker's experience for us to never see under the hood like that. I also grew to appreciate the show's structure a little more on second viewing. I was initially primed to lump the show in with The Boys as a show that superficially threatens to shake up the fabric of its status quo at the end of each episode before proceeding business as usual in the next episode. A cheap trick. But I actually think Severance goes out of its way to literalize this phenomenon more than most of its contemporaries. Almost half the episodes are about some harebrained scheme Heliar futilely comes up with to get out of Lumen, and I believe the frustrating repetition transcends hack writing and becomes expressive of how the characters believe they're changing their lives and getting out of Lumen and the severed floor, only to wind up back at square one. It's like the Shepherd tone, an audio illusion that sounds like it's constantly ascending, when in reality it's cycling the same octave over and over. Did I mention the myth of Sisyphus? In other words, I see this as an example of the show knowingly playing with the form and TV tradition to convey character arcs. I bring this up because Season 2 takes this idea and stretches it even further, with an amorphous, structural nightmare that makes Season 1 look like the epitome of convention. It's kind of like the difference between Twin Peaks the original show and Twin Peaks the Return. The Season 1 finale cuts off right at the biggest suggestion of status quo change yet, naturally, and I think a lot of us expected Mark's big reveal to be kind of shrugged off off at the start of Season 2, only for tensions to continue building at a similar pace to Season 1. That would be the safe, traditional progression of things, if only because the show wouldn't have anywhere to go if everyone just listened to Mark and found Gemma and shut Lumen down. I think they actually handle this fork in the road brilliantly by utilizing the show's stratified structure to go down both paths at once. We get a tongue-in-cheek rendering of Mark and the gang saving the world, only to see that things only change marginally in the office as a result of their revolution. Oh my god, it's Alia Shawkat. Then in the next episode, we see that status quo actually didn't even change and Lumen put out all their fires, but everybody is now fundamentally motivated in a new way. Because of the Westworld-esque innie-outie mutual exclusivity, the show is able to lie to us in a way that doesn't feel deceptive. They set themselves up in a way that allows them to have their status quo cake and eat it too. Except they don't eat it. They proceed to throw it out the window completely. Like I said at the start of this section, the show has been inherently stratified from the start, but looking back at Season 1, it's incredible how much it still clings to the fundamentals of normalcy we expect in a TV show. We would see pretty much every lead in every episode and get a balance of inside and outside world. It was a very clear, simple structure. Inside, we stick to the MDR office with only brief detours. The quad cubicle is basically the Sex and the City brunch check-in. And outside, we follow Mark and only Mark. I guess Miss Cobell is the connective tissue of the season, as the only outie we know of existing in both worlds. It makes sense then that with Season 2 totally shafting Cobell, the distance between these worlds is only amplified. This season pretty much completely staggers episodes taking place in the office and episodes taking place in the outside world. We now follow every character's outie, so the narrative in the outside world is able to jump around essentially wherever between these characters who, by design, do not interact with each other, like members of the Bluth family or residents of Lena Dunham's New York, as opposed to keeping us anchored to Mark. Characters disappear, and then we'll spend entire episodes with one character primarily. Like I said, Miss Cobell isn't even in the vast majority of the season, then gets a solo episode that could so easily have been massaged into the rest of the episodes. I'm half convinced the show was ordered for one more episode than it actually intended to make, and so cobbled together all of the one-off Cobell scenes previously sprinkled throughout into its own makeshift episode. Gemma/Miss Casey disappears, only to get an episode cycling through her entire backstory and showing us everything that's been happening to her at Lumen. That episode at least feels more cohesive and purposeful than the Cobell episode, but couched within a superficial narrative of Mark recovering from reintegration sickness, it's still very representative of this staunch compartmentalization that I've been talking about ad nauseum. That these two episodes occur back-to-back in the season slate only exacerbates the Ramy sensation, disrupts the emulsion process. It does not slot into the regular flow of the season, and that's because the season basically has no flow. If we have no other metric to observe this lack of structure, then look at how all over the place the opening credits are, essentially flipping back and forth between the new updated Season 2 title sequence, something that many shows change from season to season, and this stripped down title card that seems to basically just serve the purpose of announcing that we're watching a special episode. After checking in with the innies and then the outies in episodes 1 and 2 respectively, then a glimpse at what a normal Season 1-esque episode would look like in episode 3, we get episode 4, Woe's Hollow. Taking place entirely in a new setting we haven't seen and never returned to, the episode announces very early on that this is a special episode, one of those The Last of Us-esque, potentially award-baiting, format-breaking episodes, which is confirmed by the stripped-down title card. I think in the case of Woe's Hollow, the narrative does earn the weight all these special, formal signifiers give it, as it unveils the season's biggest and most philosophically challenging reveal. However, I can't help but feel like the weight of this departure episode is dampened somewhat by the number of subsequent format-breaking episodes in the season and its wonky character economy. Even though Britt Lauer is in basically every episode, the character Heliar is only in 4 out of the 10 episodes, which is crazy for someone who is essentially the deuteragonist of the series. You could argue that Mark's innie and outie are each other's deuteragonists, but I think that's no longer the case after the Season 2 finale. Point is, as a result of all this stratification, Heliar's entire arc this season basically consists of moping about her outie, having sex with Mark S., getting mad at Milchick, the real star of this season, and helping out with the final scheme. Coupled with how much of the narrative this season is stalled by awkward pauses and elaborate camera sequences, there seems to be a lot of cushion padding a thin narrative and thinner relationship development. After complicating the philosophy of identity to such an extreme point at the Ortbo, the show doesn't really seem to know what to do in the aftermath. Characters talk about stuff like, how could you tell it wasn't me? But none of of this is dramatized in any way after Woe's Hollow, so it kind of falls off our radar. For as much as the show asserts that things are back to normal after the events of season 1 and the characters are back to their posts, pretty much no work gets done, we spend hardly any time in the MDR office, the office changes, and we don't get any time adjusting to the new normal or establishing this sense of new status quo. Nowhere is this more felt than with Irving's arc. His innie gets fired early on and is absent from the rest of the season, clocking in even fewer episodes than Helliar with 3. Actually, when you think about it, the two innies never actually interact after the season 1 finale, which I suppose does give some genuine consequence to the OTC plan. Irving's firing is supposed to evoke a sense of him getting killed off, complete with a funeral retirement sequence. But without consistently re-establishing the new normal world of the MDR office, we really don't feel his absence. There's just too much other shit going on that pulls our attention away from it. Or look at Dylan's arc with Gretchen. They meet once, then they kiss the second time they meet, then she leaves the third time they meet, which breaks his heart to the point of quitting Lumen. I know the innies are emotionally deprived, so this stuff probably affects them quicker than it would in Audi, but one can't deny the sense that this arc rushes into its conclusion before we can even get a sense of them loving each other for a while. In comparison, think of all the will they won't they flirting between Bert and Irving in season 1, so that it felt emotionally justified when Irving changes his fealty to Keir. I'll defer to that Captain Midnight video about short seasons again, in particular because he argues a case for filler. And I want to add to that in this discussion to say that the beauty of filler is that it forces us to adapt to a new status quo for a while. Characters break up, and then we'll get some case of the week filler while they're broken up for all that time, and as a result, we feel like we've actually lived that emotional experience properly. Filler serves the purpose of passively reinforcing this very important emotion. In Severance, without seeing how the characters bounce off of each other and react to their situations in different ways, either hiding discoveries or getting in cahoots together, and more importantly, spending time living and working, we lose a sense of narrative or emotional progression. All of this stuff bothered me at first, and to an extent still does, but just like the mystery boxes in season 1 began to grow on me, this season really began to open up for me once I looked at it through the lens that the new MDR setup is in fact not the new status quo. The new status quo is actually this very sense of flux in and of itself. Lumen can't put what happened back in the bottle, and in HBO's Watchmen fashion, the very narrative fabric of the show is splitting apart. The innies get increasingly closer to knowing their outies, interfacing with the people their outies know, and getting fired from their innie lives, and having their very identities co-opted by their outies, and in Mark's case, undergoing the reintegration procedure. The closer the innies and outies get to each other, the further the distance feels. Their brains become mental soup, and I believe the wonky ostentatiousness of this season reflects that mental soup on a formal level. Character psychology rather than narrative is informing form here, and I think that's incredibly ambitious, and I respect the hell out of it. There is a cost to all of this, though. By the end of the season, this conceptual justification starts to fall apart, and even though I ultimately do admire a lot about this season, I have to be honest about the fact that it kind of crash lands into its final act. I think where we end is a dramatically logical point. I think it's a strong narrative decision for innie Mark to form a directly antagonistic relationship with outie Mark. I guess there's always been an inherent antagonism between the outies engineering the innie's servitude, but now the aggression is flipped in the opposite direction. Mark S. deciding to burrow himself deeper into Lumen does call to mind the transition in Breaking Bad of going from him feeling trapped in his circumstance to willfully keeping himself there for his own benefit. But I think we get to this point way too soon for how the season played out. Again, they have a brilliant setup for a seasonal arc with the Helena mix-up at the Ortbow, and they just don't know what to do with it, so they pivot into this Cold Harbor arc, which is apparently the most important thing in the world all of a sudden, even though we've seen nothing of Mark S. working on the file, or the executives being particularly perturbed about how lax the MDR team is when they're this close to completing what is supposedly the overarching goal of the entire Severance program. They end this Gemma rescue mission with what one could argue is the payoff to the romantic complication posed earlier in the season, Mark choosing Helly over Gemma. But we don't feel like these two have actually had to wrestle with any romantic issues to get to this point. Mark having slept with Helena completely dissolves as a point of conflict with Helliar, and we don't feel the extent of their love because they spend so much time apart. Like with Dylan and Gretchen, there's only one single episode reinforcing their relationship. How am I supposed to buy that Mark S. is so in love with her that he'll sabotage the entire operation for her? In season 1, they at least have some flirtation here and there to build up to the finale, even though I thought the moment at the elevator was still a little rushed. This is a whole new level, though. What if Helena had been the quote-unquote villain of this season? What if it were about about Helliar reckoning with who she is and increasing the level of warfare against herself and against Mark S. Then we do all this Cold Harbor stuff next season, and when Mark S makes this sacrifice, it feels like he's actually doing it for something that cost him and us time. To a lesser extent, stratification is responsible for how unearned it feels how Cobell comes back into the fold. Like, did I miss something, or did Devin have some sort of off-screen change of heart? You know what would have solved this? Having the characters interact with each other. In Season 1, Miss Casey is largely a separate entity that primarily interfaces with the MDR members on a one-to-one basis, but the episode that really defines her as a character and underlines her as someone to pay emotional attention to in our heads is when she spends the day in the MDR room and interacts with the cast. Being completely siphoned off this season is equally responsible for how out of the blue the Cold Harbor finale feels. You know what would have solved this? Bringing Miss Casey back and having the characters interact with each other. I hate to apply, here's how I would have written it criticism, but imagine learning this stuff about Gemma while Miss Casey still has to maintain her job within the MDR team. Imagine the wrinkles that would create with Helliar and or Helena knowing Miss Casey's relationship with Mark in the outside world. Imagine Irving mourning the loss of Bert with the team, unaware that his Audi is also getting close with Bert. This stuff is basic dramatic irony that is lost when the characters stop interacting with each other. I could go on, but I hope you see what stratification is doing. There are many viable criticisms of this season, but I think just about every issue, at least that I have, boils down to how separate the characters are from each other. And I get it. Writing characters interacting is hard. I don't even say that to be patronizing to Erickson and Stiller and the staff writers. I completely understand the temptation to find other cinematic ways of expressing these feelings, especially when Apple is bankrolling every camera gimmick under the sun. But ultimately, there's a degree to which this all becomes a cop-out and sheer overcompensation. Look no further than the number of superficial obstacles and repetitions of Season 1's greatest hits and epic action moments in the finale. We get one monumental character interaction early on that plays into the strengths of stratification, and the rest is empty spectacle.
Philosophy is the talk on a cereal box. Religion is the smile on a dog.
Look, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe this is a case of screenwriter brain, or rather telewriter brain, and I can't divorce the experience of watching a TV show from these structural norms that have been relentlessly drilled into my head. As a proponent of art, shouldn't I celebrate deviations from the vanilla American mold? Shouldn't I believe that this medium is capable of more than just observationally filming people in rooms talking? I made this video in part to talk about a whole smorgasbord of shows I've wanted to make videos about for years, but also to articulate a commonality I've noticed between all of them. I think stratification is the ultimate consequence of how streaming TV is transitioned into the digital age, and like anything else, it is a tool capable of both good and evil. In this particular case, I think it poses an especially strong temptation to use all the shiny new toys available to us and lose sight of the foundation those toys are built on. But I think there's a way to be better. We don't need to work entirely backwards, but people clearly still respond to certain consistencies that are disappearing. I'm far from the first to say this, but look at the success of a show like The Bear, a show I'm not even all that crazy about, but I can recognize that it satisfies a hunger for yearly releases, for a main cast essentially trapped in a pressure cooker together, forced to interact with each other. The show is at its weakest when it deviates from that mold. I certainly think longer seasons would help, not necessarily the full bloat of an old school 24-episode order, but something that allows for some cushion room to breathe and live in a world. This would entail stretching a budget across more episodes than 8 or 9 per season, meaning lower budget episodes per capita, but I don't think that would be such a bad thing right now. I think shows would also benefit from holding themselves to a consistent episode length. A show doesn't need to adhere to an hour or half-hour model, but just internal consistency goes a long way. This isn't just true of TV, this is even true of, like, YouTube, which has never had runtime mandates. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm saying this in an hour-long video after 4 months of radio silence and a norm of 10 to 20-minute videos. But look at me as a cautionary tale. I would personally, selfishly benefit from more consistency on my channel, and that's why I feel such a personal investment in TV shows adopting these strategies themselves. Anyway, I'm far from alone in thinking all this, and I think the streaming giants are increasingly experiencing the consequences of how they've changed the system. Things look a little dire right now, but in the wake of collapse, there is always an opportunity to create. That is it from me this time around. First video of 2025, feels good to be back, you know? like, share, comment, subscribe. My links are in the description. I guess I'll plug my Patreon again. You heard the spiel before. There's some good shit up there that you just might be missing out on. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you'd like to see me cover. I haven't done much comment input in a while. I don't know. That could be good. But above all else, I just want to say thank you for watching and goodbye.